Even with the rapid changes that occurred in the 20th century to promote diversity and representation of various races, genders, and sexual orientations as a result of the women's rights movement, the civil rights movement, the feminist movement, and the gay rights movement, society continues to repress any identity or lifestyle that is seen as radical. Due to the various religious, social, and patriarchal influences that have been imposed upon every individual for centuries, it is assumed that every individual is heterosexual or should strive to perform and present themselves as white cis heterosexuals. This idea refers to the term heteronormativity. In the most basic terms, Oxford English Dictionary defines heteronormative as of designating or based on a worldview which regards gender roles as fixed to biological sex and heterosexuality as the normal and preferred sexual orientation. This term first appeared and was popularized in 1991 by social theorist Michael Warner in his book Fear of a Queer Planet. In this quote provided from the text, Warner describes how feminist social theory was the first step and most basic initiation in straying from heteronormative behaviors through the opposing of typical domestic gender roles. However, at the same time, this effort still reinforced male gender roles as it illustrated where men were on a social, economic, and political scale. Warner's text takes on the idea of a queer theory and how it is criticizing heteronormativity and the ways in which individuals can reject it. When trying to find a definition that encapsulated this term in a more current, advanced way, I found that the Queer Dictionary did an excellent job at conceptualizing all the ideas that this word encompasses. The Queer Dictionary defines heteronormativity as the belief or assumption that all people are heterosexual, or that heterosexuality is the default or normal state of being. It tends to complement and accompany concepts like cisnormativity, gender binarism, and gender essentialism. A heteronormative society operates on the assumption that heterosexuality and specific gender features are the human default. These assumptions can be hurtful because they are stigmatizing and marginalizing, making people who are LGBT+ feel that they are perceived as deviant or unnatural. Heteronormativity subconsciously influences the way we think about families, marriage, and love, and what they should look like. Sex education is a prime example of how an individual is influenced to believe the standard heteronormative image. For decades, sex education has been taught to adolescents in a restrictive, beating around the bush type of way. Every child is taught about the anatomy of a female and a male body, and how they work together for the sole purpose of procreation. Sex education assumes that every child will grow up to be a part of an abstaining, monogamous, heterosexual relationship. Even if they don't believe that, schools still refrain from educating the public on the various sexual orientations and how to be safe about sex. John Oliver from Last Week Tonight highlights this problem in a conversation about America's sex education system.
But Mississippi's restrictions are just the beginning here. In 8 states, there are laws considerably limiting what teachers can say about homosexuality to their students, meaning the answer to that kid's question, is it okay to be gay, could be a shrug or a lot worse. And Utah's law prohibits any instruction in the intricacies of intercourse, for reasons that one state legislator explained.
Those are the things we do not want to be taught in our schools. Those are things that should be taught in your home.
Wait, taught in your home? Here is an exchange that has never happened. How are you so good at sex? I was homeschooled. And in certain districts around the country, the only sex ed you might receive is abstinence only, which you may think of as a relic of the past, but it is still very much around. Congress recently increased federal funding for abstinence-only education from about $50 to $75 million per year. And
This is a terrifying phenomenon that is projected onto hundreds of schools across the country that seeks to hide kids from exploring identities and desires, or just abstain from them altogether. In addition to this, as a result of the way that society has projected heteronormative ideals in education and popular media, it is also hurtful in the ways that people from the LGBTQ+ community identify and define themselves based on society's ideas of what it means to be a part of this community. Rowan Ellis, a proud LGBTQ+ and feminist activist, addresses this issue through the lens of being a lesbian woman.
But there's a kind of secondary side to this, and that's that a lot of queer people, when they're growing up, also have that same heterosexual idea of happiness fed to them, and they buy into it. This is why, you know, as a queer person, you might not be brought up in a homophobic environment, you might not really necessarily think that anyone is going to react negatively to you coming out. It can still be hard to come out because you also have to reconcile it with your ideas of what happiness are. Even before you come out to yourself, it can feel invalid or confusing to be having these feelings because it's not what is meant to be happening to you. This also unfortunately can lead to hatred within the community. People talking about, oh, it's okay to be gay in this way, but it's not okay to be gay in that way. Essentially the idea of, oh, I might not be able to fulfill the heterosexual part of this kind of dream life, but I can still be a man, or I can still be a woman. And that can be equally as damaging within the community as it can from the outside world.
Ellis reimagines this term by describing how individuals of the LGBTQ+ community still try and present oneself in a heterosexual way in order to fit into the norm society has created. This idea connects to a similar concept that has stemmed from heteronormativity, which is homonormativity. Homonormativity asserts the idea that any individual that identifies themselves as part of the LGBTQ+ community should assimilate to an acceptable version of oneself that society would not see as radical in order to fit into the norm of a white cis heterosexual person. In an article written by Laura Kaser from a magazine called Everyday Feminism, Kaser states that homonormativity explains how certain aspects of the queer community can perpetuate assumptions, values, and behaviors that hurt and marginalize many folks within this community, as well as those with whom the community should be working in solidarity. She then further explains this definition by highlighting how it also describes the assumption that queer people want to be part of the dominant mainstream heterosexual culture, in the way in which our society rewards those who do so, identifying them as most worthy and deserving of visibility and rights. In other words, it is assumed that there are respectable roles in society, and anyone who behaves, presents, or appears outside of those maintained standards is radical. This puts limits on how one can express themselves on a day-to-day basis. This limitation strays over into the concept of marriage and how homonormativity asserts the idea that queer individuals should follow the same familial structure as heterosexual couples. Kaser's article explains this kind of limitation, stating, even as marriage becomes inclusive of a particular kind of queer relationship, it perpetuates a policing of other kinds of relationships, maintaining the borderline of what is an acceptable queer relationship. Heteronormativity and homonormativity work side by side to police how individuals should desire, love, and express themselves. The media, social media, politics, pretty much every aspect of our society creates an idealized standard that every individual has to assimilate to in order to not be viewed as the other. Because this concept is so engraved into every system, institution, and state of mind, it is difficult to try and reject such an idea. However, this doesn't mean that it is impossible. We are currently immersed in a world that is becoming more accepting and has more representation in media and in reality than ever before. Progress is being made in the ways in which individuals are able to freely express and present themselves. Despite the hateful policies and bigotry that has been running our nation, people are overcoming boundaries every day in order to redefine what is normal.